Welcome to This Constitution. I'm Matthew Brogdon. I'm joined today by a very special guest here to talk with us about Mercy Otis Warren, one of our forgotten founders and one of the most important women at the American founding. Kirstin Birkhaug is an assistant professor of political science at Hope College, and she's a scholar, an eminent scholar of the American founding and American political thought. Kirstin, welcome to This Constitution.
Thank you, Matthew. Great to be with you today.
So we're going to talk about Mercy Otis Warren. Most people, most Americans, probably don't know who Mercy Otis Warren is, even though she's crucially important. So tell us a little bit about Mercy. And of course, she has two names, Otis and Warren. She really belongs to two founding families that play an important role in the American founding. So introduce us to Mercy Otis Warren.
Sure thing. So Mercy Otis Warren, she's born in 1728, and she is born to kind of preeminent family in New England and Massachusetts, specifically the Otis family. She has some older brothers, some younger sisters as well. She grows up in a highly educated family. So I'll just tell you a little bit about her life to kind of get going, I suppose. A kind of unusual thing about Mercy Otis Warren that I think is important to highlight is that she has the unusual experience for women of her day of having an education that was typically reserved for young men. So she has two older brothers, and her father made particular sorts of circumstances for them to be educated with a local reverend. And over the course of their time with the Reverend, the idea was that this education would prepare them for careers at Harvard. Only one of them, her older brother, James Otis, went on to actually attend Harvard. Her other brother decided that he wasn't going to attend Harvard and as such ceased these lessons. And her father, somewhat surprisingly, instead of just allowing James to go on his own, sent Mercy in her other brother's place. So she has this experience of being educated fairly liberally, reading the texts that many young men read as preparation for attending universities, and as such kind of grows up a really lively mind, deep thinker, and early on a writer, although she would not publish for some time to come. In fact, as she grows older, there are some historical narratives of her that suggest that the reason she gets married relatively later on in life, she's in her late 20s when she eventually marries James Warren, who is famous in his own right and a kind of prominent general during the American Revolution, that perhaps she wasn't as much of a marketable bride for some of these men who courted her because she was so intelligent. And certainly we have records from people like John Adams writing to her that I feel a sense of inferiority whenever I speak to you. I feel that your attainments dwarf those of most men. So she is absolutely a kind of commanding figure. But at any rate, she marries James Warren in 1754. They have 5 sons. And by the time the American Revolution begins to get going, she's already in her 30s and 40s as the kind of lead up begins. And throughout her kind of middling adulthood, her 30s and 40s, she retains a kind of really close relationship with her brother, James. James Otis goes on to be one of the most important members of the Sons of Liberty. In fact, he's kind of their de facto leader for a time. And throughout the course of the lead up to the American Revolution is inspiring people like John Adams to command certain types of political rhetoric. He's an extremely humane thinker, lots of ideas about potentially granting better rights to Native Americans, ending the slavery of enslaved Black Americans, equal rights for women are already sort of on his mind in the lead up to the revolution. And Mercy's talking with him and adopting a lot of his political ideas. They read a lot of books together in the lead up to the American Revolution. And as a result, she's always kind of thinking about politics. However, James Otis, a kind of forgotten name in American history, this is in part because in the 1760s, he gets into an altercation with a British officer, wherein the British officer canes him over the head. And he sustains a brain injury that he never recovers from. So this kind of bright light of the early revolutionary age is sort of snuffed out. And Mercy kind of takes up the mantle of continuing his kind of progressive thoughts and ideas into the revolution and beyond. She writes early on in 1774, after the Boston Tea Party, a poem that John Adams reads and says, "If you don't publish this, I will have it published on your behalf." And she says, "Why don't you take it and you can publish it on my behalf?" And such begins her publishing career, which is storied. And I'm happy to talk more about that. But that's a sort of 30,000 foot overview of Mercy Otis Warren, her early life leading up to the Revolution.
Mercy Otis Warren has quite a correspondence throughout her life. One of the places that I know I've encountered her in reading is in the correspondence she has with prominent Americans. You've already mentioned John Adams, whom she corresponds with. And by the way, the fact that Adams would say that he felt sort of intimidated by her towering intellect is quite a statement, because I don't think Adams often felt humbled by anyone's presence. So that's quite a compliment. Who else was she connected with? What if we're thinking of her in connection with other people we know at the founding? Sort of what are the cords that attach her to these other parts of the sort of founding family?
Surely. So her entire family, her brothers, her father, her father-in-law, and her husband are all prominent Massachusetts politicians. So surely she's kind of directly in their inner circle and influencing
And
them.
James Warren, you mentioned he was a Civil War general. He also plays a major role in state government. At one point, he's the Speaker of the Massachusetts House. And does he play a role in the Continental Congress much during the Revolution? Warren?
Yeah, certainly. He's involved.
Okay.
He's an active member. He is a part of the kind of engine that's firing all of these ideas throughout all of this process. So certainly she's someone who has his ear. They're communicating. In fact, their relationship shares some similarities, although it would be hard to put it on a par with that of John Adams and Abigail Adams. But they share certainly a friendship, a kind of equality that was unusual for the time, but has a kind of prominence among a couple of those significant couples in the early American sort of era. Yeah.
Did she write for theater as well? Did she have a play that she wrote?
She wrote 5, in fact. Yeah.
Okay.
So many of her plays, which she writes throughout the course of the Revolution and the founding era, many of them are political propaganda plays. And obviously she's writing kind of on behalf of individual liberty, locking in understanding of rights, a general understanding of this new national project of America, which for an anti-federalist, she was kind of uniquely invested in. And yes, so she writes all of these. She models a number of characters after Thomas Hutchinson, who was a prominent enemy of her family, her father, her brothers, her husband, and so forth. He is often styled as the villains here, who are out to get the rights of individuals, who are sort of rapacious in their desire to remove liberty and justice from people. So yes, she writes a number of these, which are excellent, which are funny, and also do a great job of conveying a lot of her ideas about civic virtue.
And Thomas Hutchinson, he's the royal governor in Massachusetts. I have the right end of that stick?
Yes.
Okay. So Hutchinson's the royal governor through, was he the governor during the Boston Massacre or just later during the Tea Party and so forth? Or was he there throughout, right up until the British occupation of Boston?
Yeah, I believe he's there the whole time. At any rate, there's certainly a long and storied history in the kind of political animosity between the Otis family and Hutchinson. And I think this is the sort of essential thing here is that Hutchinson is the royal governor of Massachusetts. If there is anything true about the Otises, they are no fan of the royal family of Great Britain, and kind of any emissaries of the royal family subsequently earn their ire.
So, I mean, she's writing satires about King George's royal governor during this period of unrest from the Boston Massacre in 1770 right up through the Tea Party in 1773, And then, of course, the British finally occupy Boston in 1775, about the time we're getting Lexington and Concord and the, first shots of this conflict over American independence. And she's playing kind of like Saturday Night Live through this whole saga. So not a shrinking violet, not someone who's timid about engaging in controversy. But she has to do much of this under a pen name, right? I mean, does she publish anything under her own name early on? I know later we're going to talk about some things she does, but we know that women frequently would publish things under pen names and so forth. But what is it that she's publishing under her own name in this period?
Very little, generally. So one of her favorite pen names during this era is the Citizen of Columbia. So she's already styling herself as a citizen. She's writing from the perspective of someone who is firmly vested in this particular land and has an affinity for it. She plants herself in line with the Americans in any and every sense. In general, the use of pen names during this period, to some extent, they may have veiled identities. I think famously, Publius remains relatively secretive until, I believe, after Hamilton's death or something of the like. But then comparatively, there are other people who are writing under pen names that are virtually open secrets. And Warren was closer to an open secret than someone who was really trying to shield her identity. In fact, much of the biographical information we have about Warren indicates that the reason she chose to write under a pen name as often as she did, especially early on, was at least in part due to a kind of internal tension that she felt about her own role as a wife and a mother, and also someone who had a political voice. So Warren is, I think, a traditionalist when it comes to gender roles in this regard. She's certainly not someone we would call a proto-feminist. And this shows up in her use of something like a pen name. She's caught between this intellect that pulls her towards writing political propaganda plays, writing lots of poems during this time as well. She starts with that first Squabble of the Seasons poem in 1774. She goes on to write many more. And in fact, her biographer, Nancy Stewart, or Reuben Stewart, calls her the muse of the revolution for the number of things that she's writing, literary sorts of styles of writing that she's doing at this time. But at the same time, there is this inherent tension that she feels. And that's part of the reason why we have so much by her that's written under that pen name.
Now, the most famous thing that Mercy Otis writes, the thing that probably shows up on anyone's bookshelf if they have anything by her, is this history of the American Revolution. She writes a history, long title, The Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution. Come back to the termination bit in a minute. That seems ominous. But she writes that late in life, and if you want a copy of it, you can get it from Liberty Fund. And if you want to read a review of the Liberty Fund edition, you can go read your review on the Liberty Law blog that Liberty Fund runs. So tell us a little about this history, and make sure you tell us why she says termination at the end. What's with the termination is an ominous way to end a title.
Certainly. So she writes this in 1805. She is nearing the end of her 70s, and she has seen many things come and go and pass. For what it's worth, this is not the first authoritative account of the American Revolution. There's actually one that's written earlier by a doctor, and it is, in fact, a very clinical account. David Ramsey is the doctor who writes it. And for what it's worth, I've read this history. I much prefer Mercy Otis Warren's, purely from a literary perspective. That first account, well, probably more factually correct, is almost certainly drier, and it gets less of the sentiment right. And this is oftentimes what I return to with Mercy Otis Warren, and something that comes up in that review that you mentioned. By the way, I do, in fact, endorse that particular version of this work by Warren. Lester Cohen's introduction is absolutely terrific on it. So grab a copy of that particular edition if you're looking for one.
And I think you can, Liberty Fund puts all their books online as PDFs too, right?
Yes, it is accessible, I think, for free online. Yeah. In fact, I know that for certain because I actually accessed it today. But yes, so Warren, she writes this grand history, and modern day historians tend to critique Warren's practice of historical writing, in part because compared to someone like Ramsay, and certainly compared to modern day historians who put a high premium on accuracy and fact checking, she gets some things wrong. She writes the history from her memory. She confuses things at times, and she also embellishes. So this is a situation in which Thomas Hutchinson reemerges as a kind of cartoonishly illustrated villain anytime she has an opportunity to insert any member of either the Otis or the Warren family as a kind of conquering hero. She does it, right? So there's elements of narrative in this accounting. And what I've argued with regards to this history is that Warren's project, and this is really clear if you read the other things she's written leading up to this, it's less about providing this factual accounting of history. That's important. She wants to tell us the events that happened. She wants to get it somewhat right. But what she wants to do is capture this memory of the American Revolution, and in particular, the lead up to it, what it was costing people to live under this oppressive British regime, the kind of keen despair that people felt at the loss of liberty. And then throughout the course of the revolution, the steam that this movement picks up, the ways in which Americans are able to get behind it, the excellent leadership of George Washington, who she is a little wary of pretty much throughout the entirety of his life. She's always concerned that Washington has the potential to become a kind of Caesar, which, for what it's worth, is true. Lucky for us, Washington is more Cincinnatus than Caesar. But she's always concerned that he could verge into that sort of territory. Throughout the course of the history, she gives a kind of great accounting of his own greatness in leadership, his ability to facilitate unity and a kind of sense of strength among soldiers throughout the course of a pretty gnarly war, and leading up to what she calls the kind of termination of the American Revolution. At the end of all of this, and again, Warren is writing this about 20-ish years after the passage of the Constitution, for which she had significant criticisms. Warren is concerned that the spirit of the American Revolution is dying out, that there is not continued emphasis placed upon the need for liberty. What it means to not be free is no longer something that Americans think about or remember. And she hopes in part with this history to instill some of that back into American culture and American memory, to kind of reinvigorate this memory of the American Revolution and its principles, which she says are well encapsulated in the Declaration of Independence, not coincidentally.
So you have this person who, she, following in the footsteps of her brother James Otis, takes up the mantle of sort of the Sons of Liberty, of revolution. Surely she cheered the Declaration of Independence, the claim by Americans to have the power to form their own governments, to form new constitutions. So very much a friend of American independence, very much a patriot in that regard. None of these sort of loyalist reservations that, some of those Bostonians that got on the ship and left after Washington drove them out of Boston had. Then we get a change. Whenever we get to the Constitution, we get to 1787 and the Constitution is proposed. We go through a ratification struggle in 1787 and 1788. Each state has to debate the merits of the Constitution in a convention that they've selected and decide whether to adopt it or not. And you've already said that Mercy Otis Warren is among the ranks of the anti-federalists in this struggle. Of course, this is a little bit of these names. I'm sure she probably chafed under the anti-federalist label like everybody else. It's a little bit of offensive to opponents of the Constitution. They said, no, why are you calling us anti-federalists? Because we're the people who like federalism. We're the people who like states and local self-government. And it's you people running around saying you're federalists who want to centralize power, destroy federalism, create one uniform nation. So she finds herself as an anti-federalist, as potentially an opponent of the Constitution. So help me understand, what's her beef with the Constitution? What's so bad about the work of the framers? After all, her friend John Adams thinks the Constitution's fine. What's her problem with the Constitution?
She does write a whole essay on this. In 1788, she publishes Observations on the New Constitution, which is part of this sort of zeitgeist of letter writing campaigns that happens during the ratification conventions or in the lead up to the ratification conventions. Of course, you have the Federalist Papers being written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. There's kind of a cohesiveness around these Federalist Papers. They hang together well. They do appear to be a kind of narrative that's of a piece. They're written under one author, even though we can kind of sort of see who's writing what as we look back in retrospect. Comparatively, the Anti-Federalists are more decentralized, and they have less in common with one another than the Federalists have in common. So we're getting writers like Cato, Brutus, Sentinel, who surely all share a kind of distress about what the new Constitution might bring, but they're not all necessarily of a piece in quite the same way. And Warren is one more voice in this chorus. And for Warren, the key issues with the Constitution she saw as in line with many of the same things as some of the other Anti-Federalists, a kind of failure to emphasize individual rights. Bill of Rights in particular was one of her prescriptions. And in fact, Observations on the New Constitution is frequently regarded as one of the linchpins in securing that Bill of Rights. So an amazing legacy for her in that regard.
A historical curiosity. Does she publish her essay? What kind of relationship did it have to the Massachusetts Ratification Convention? Was she writing that ahead of the convention or after it? Do you happen to?
I don't know off the top of my head. My guess is that she would have been keenly attuned to when the Massachusetts Ratification Convention would have been, and it's likely she wrote it beforehand, but I don't have those dates in my brain.
Because interestingly, Massachusetts, I think, is the first state to send its certification of ratification to Congress along with a list of proposed amendments. And I think it's sometime in the winter of 1788. I think January, February, somewhere in there.
If I remember correctly, she writes in October.
Okay.
So that would be right in
well
the
ahead.
Yes,
that's when Pennsylvania's doing it. So Massachusetts, I mean, this is an interesting connection because Massachusetts in the middle of the winter in 1788 is not the first state to ratify. Several states have already done so. They're kind of in the middle of the pack. But they send this list along with their sort of, whatever the document is they send to say, we've now ratified the Constitution. And it's accompanied with a list of proposed amendments, a fairly lengthy one. And every single state after that ratifies, right up through, or at least in the 1788 struggle, right up through the 11th state, New York, in July, all send similar lists. The lists start to look similar. They've got some things in common. But Massachusetts really starts a trend there that start proposing amendments. And they create enough pressure that James Madison and his friends in the first Congress do write a proposed Bill of Rights. One of these wonderful documents behind us, the one all the way on the right. They proposed 12 amendments, most of which were not quite what Warren and some of her other friends were asking for, but they do get it. So apparently quite effective.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that she's insistent on is stronger protections for freedom of the press, which of course gets rolled into that Bill of Rights as well. Something that is kind of clearly evident. It's in the Observations and it's added to the Bill of Rights. So a kind of really clear connection there for her. But she's also concerned about some other things. She thinks the executive and the judiciary are far too close together, that there's too much room for corruption between them. She's really concerned about the standing army or the potential for a federal standing army, which many of the Anti-Federalists were, but she viewed that as kind of antithetical to democracy, to liberty, that it would be a kind of perpetual threat. But in general, Warren is a little bit different than the Anti-Federalists and all of the other founders because she writes from the perspective of someone whose primary engagement in politics is civic. It's not legal. She doesn't have the full range of legal rights that men do. Coverture laws, to the extent that they would have applied to her, which coverture laws at this point were legal fictions that subsumed the identities of married women into their husbands upon marriage, making it difficult for them to own property individually, things of that nature. So when she's writing as someone who is engaging with politics civilly as someone who is educating 5 sons, as someone who is a tested builder of communities, as someone who is a stoker of civil discourse. So to that extent, she's concerned about the extent to which the Constitution is going to inculcate civic virtue, and in particular, a kind of preserved memory of the principles of the American Revolution. And she just doesn't see it. In fact, the very first line of her observations on the new Constitution critiques what she calls theoretical regimes that have placed too much of a premium on theorizing about liberty without inculcating the necessary practices that will protect it. So that's really her central sort of issue with the Constitution, is it doesn't do enough to sort of understand what the practical mechanisms will be to protect liberty in the long run.
So that raises a really interesting question. You've already mentioned in terms of her complaints against the Constitution, and this is true of the proposed amendments that states send that we were talking about, are not just about rights as we think about them, things like free press, freedom of speech, and free conscience, but are institutional complaints. They're not happy with the way that things are arranged. It's the status of the Army, the structure and extent of the judiciary, the powers of the presidency, the taxing powers, quite often a complaint. So you mentioned that when she talks about liberty, in fact, to capture this very clearly or succinctly, Mercy Otis Warren thinks that the Constitution is a departure from the spirit of the Revolution. It's a departure from the Declaration of Independence, not a continuation of the Declaration of Independence and the Revolution. Hence the title of her book, The Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution. She doesn't just mean the end of the war. She means the Constitution ended the revolutionary tradition and moved into something else. So help me understand a little more. When she says liberty, that the Constitution has given up on liberty or departed from the tradition of liberty, what does she mean?
So I think it's important to highlight here that Warren is a Lockean, the central thinker who occupies her primary place in political theory is John Locke, who is someone she reads with James Otis, her brother. While James is at Harvard, they share this book. They exchange ideas about it. There's a great dual biography of Mercy Warren and James Otis called, I believe, Hearts and Minds. It's by Jeffrey Hacker. That sort of details these exchanges that they had where they were developing these political ideas. Locke is also the primary thinker for James Otis. So if we think about Locke, emphasis on the right to rebellion, on the need to recognize tyrannical regimes when they occur and repel them, reject them, and the need ultimately to be left alone by one's government to the extent that it is reasonable. Those are the things that she's not seeing carried through in the Constitution in the same sorts of ways that she's seeing in the Declaration of Independence. And that makes a lot of sense. Thomas Jefferson's writing the Declaration of Independence, and he is copy-pasting from Locke. So it would make sense to the extent that Warren approves of the Declaration of Independence, she approves of Jefferson's Lockean predispositions. Comparatively, if you look at the names that get mentioned at the Constitutional Convention, Locke gets mentioned, surely, but he is not the most mentioned name, which is actually something that is a kind of recurring and emerging debate in scholars of American political thought, is the extent to which Locke actually is the father of the American political project, as he's so often purported to be. The most frequently mentioned thinker at the Constitutional Convention is Montesquieu. We're also getting...
Followed by Livy, right?
Yes.
Roman writer.
Yes, absolutely. So we're getting influences in the Constitution that are potentially different theoretical influences than those that primarily undergird the Declaration of Independence. And I think that's where Warren is seeing a bit of a tension. For what it's worth, she's not convinced that the ratification of the Constitution is the end of American liberty. It is maybe the termination in some respects of the continued spirit of the American Revolution without work. What's necessary in light of a constitution that, for Warren, ultimately doesn't do all that it could do to preserve liberty, to preserve the principles of the revolution, is that this is now going to fall to individual Americans. So the Declaration of Independence then is not just a thesis for government. It's not just an idea that undergirds institutions. It's an individual mandate for Americans, that this is something we need to read and internalize and care about, that we need to be the standard bearers for the memory of what it means not to be free, so as to never find ourselves in a situation where we stop being jealous of our own freedoms and collapse our own institutions of liberty, or worse, for Warren, we become oppressive ourselves.
So, and I think I said Livy, maybe Plutarch. Some Roman is the second most of the convention. But final question on Warren. She writes Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution in 1805. Of course, by that time, we're distant from the ratification of the Constitution. You point out we're almost 20 years out from the writing of the Constitution. We're, of course, well into our first party system at that point. We've Washington retired from the presidency in 1797. We had 4 years of John Adams. By the time we get to Warren's book, we've had 4 years of Thomas Jefferson. We're going to get 4 more years of him. So where does she fit in those politics? Is she a Jeffersonian? I assume she's a Jeffersonian, not a Federalist. How does she fit in that whole controversy once we get political parties?
So there's some really interesting history here. To the extent that we can align Warren with any one individual founder, it is Jefferson. He's the bellwether for many of her ideas. They don't agree on everything, but they agree on many things. But then that leaves the question of Adams, because we've already talked a bit about Adams and the fact that they have this close relationship. He's effectively the harbinger of her entire literary career. They fall out, and they fall out right around the Constitutional Convention. They fall out around John Adams's book that he writes called Discourses on Davila, where he's just sort of parsing through ideas on government, kind of with the American constitutional project in mind. And he seems to Warren to be entirely too sympathetic to aristocracy and to monarchy, particularly in their hereditary forms. So if you read the exchanges, there are a couple of great collections of the Warren-Adams epistolary exchanges. She exchanges letters with both John and Abigail. But there's about 10 heated letters between Mercy Otis Warren and John Adams, where John Adams is hurt by her scathing review of his book. She is incensed by what she views as him favoring or lending favor to aristocracy and monarchy, and they just can't come to a resolution. It ends their friendship. So that's a breaking point there. So to the extent that John Adams is a political figure with whom she aligns, at that point, they're pretty much no longer synced up. And in the history of the Rise, Progress, Termination of the American Revolution, she does talk about Adams. She's not entirely unsympathetic to him. She paints him as someone who generally wanted to do good, do right by his country, but fails. She characterizes him mostly as a failure. And that's also hurtful to him. So that kind of further fractures their relationship. So in the Jefferson-Adams controversy, she's ultimately going to side with Jefferson, but by that point, the kind of relationship between her and Adams had long since dissolved.
And there's another connection there, too, because by the end of their lives, Adams and Mercy Otis Warren do restore their correspondence, right? They do reconcile at some point.
Yes, very briefly, although never to the extent that they had been in the past, where they exchanged these really loving in a friendly way. They were great civic friends, and they were people who sharpened each other intellectually, and they never quite get all the way back there, but they don't die with the relationship unresolved, much in a way that sort of mirrors the Adams-Jefferson relationships, which is another one of the great civic friendships of our American history.
Well, thank you for reintroducing us to one of our forgotten founders and allowing us to get to know Mercy Otis Warren and some of your own work.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.